They call him the Devil of Wall Street, a man who builds empires on the ruins of his enemies. I was just a girl with a debt I couldn't pay, trapped in a corner by a family who saw me as a bargaining chip. I thought our marriage contract was a business deal, a way for him to buy my father's company and for me to buy my freedom. But on our wedding night, he leaned in and whispered the truth. I didn't marry you to save your family, Alara. I married you to destroy them. And you're just the most beautiful weapon I've ever held. My name is Alara, and I am the wife of a man who hates me almost as much as he craves me. This is the story of the contract that became a cage and the love that became a war. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is a room filled with expensive perfume and men in tailored suits. I stood in the center of the gala, the silk of my dress feeling like cold ice against my skin. Around me, the elite of the city laughed and drank champagne, oblivious to the fact that I was being auctioned off. My father stood beside me, his hand gripping my arm with a desperate strength. He had gambled away our legacy, our home, and our future. And tonight he was hoping to sell the only thing he had left. Me. The room went silent as the double doors at the end of the hall swung open. It wasn't just a man who walked in, it was a storm. Alaric Thorne. He didn't walk, he moved with the lethal grace of a predator who knew he was at the top of the food chain. His suit was black, his shirt was black, and his eyes were darker than both. He didn't look at the decor. He didn't look at the other billionaires. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. He walked straight toward us, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. My father's breath hitched. He began to stammer out a greeting, but Alaric didn't even acknowledge him. He stopped inches from me, his presence so overwhelming that I felt the air grow thin. He smelled of rain, expensive leather, and a power that was almost suffocating. Is this her? Alaric asked. His voice was a low velvet rasp that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. Yes, Mr. Thorne, my father whispered, his voice shaking. My daughter Alara. She's everything we discussed. The merger papers are ready. Alaric reached out, his gloved hand tilting my chin upward. He studied my face like a jeweler inspecting a diamond he intended to crush. There was no warmth in his expression. No kindness. Only a cold, burning intensity that made me feel exposed. She's far more than what we discussed, Alaric said, his thumb grazing my lower lip. You're selling me a masterpiece to cover up your crimes, Arthur. But you should know, once I buy something I never let it go. And I don't share. I found my voice, though it was barely a whisper. I am not an object to be bought, Mr. Thorne. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. In this room, Alara, everyone has a price. Yours just happens to be the survival of your family name. You have 10 minutes to say goodbye to this life. My driver is waiting. He turned and walked away, not even waiting for my answer. He knew I had no choice. My father looked at me with a mixture of guilt and relief, but I couldn't look back at him. I had just been handed over to the devil, and the worst part was, I didn't know if I was being saved or sacrificed. The car ride to his estate was a blur of city lights and crushing silence. I sat as far away from him as possible, my hands folded in my lap. Alaric sat in the shadows, his eyes fixed on a tablet, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. He seemed to have forgotten I was even there. But every time the car turned, I could feel the weight of his attention. He wasn't ignoring me, he was observing me like a hunter watching a bird in a cage. When we pulled up to the Thorne Manor, my heart plummeted. It was a fortress of black stone and glass, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning sea. It was beautiful, lonely, and terrifying. Welcome home, Alara, Alaric said, finally looking at me. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look like a statue of a vengeful god. Try not to get lost. In this house, the walls have ears, and I have very little patience for secrets. He stepped out of the car and waited for me. As I stepped onto the cold gravel, I realized that the life I knew was gone. I was no longer Alara Vance, the socialite. I was a Thorne. And in this dark world of shadows and steel, I was about to find out exactly why they called my husband the devil. If you can feel the tension between Alara and the devil boss, please subscribe to English Story with Masha and hit the like button. We are just scratching the surface of Alaric's dark obsession. Comment the word, devil, if you want to see Alara fight back in the next part. Your support helps me bring these long, emotional stories to life every day. Let's continue. The heavy oak doors of the manor closed behind us with a sound that felt like a final heartbeat. The foyer was vast, a cathedral of white marble and obsidian accents. There were no family photos on the walls, no warm colors, just a collection of sharp-edged sculptures and shadows that seemed to move in the corner of my eye. Alaric didn't offer to take my coat. He simply walked toward the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing like a drum in the hollow silence. I followed him, my heels clicking frantically to keep up with his long, confident strides. I felt small, insignificant, and cold. We reached the second floor and he stopped in front of a pair of double doors made of dark, polished wood. He didn't open them. Instead, he turned to face me, his body blocking the entrance to what I assumed was our shared life. He looked down at me, his eyes scanning my face with that same clinical intensity. He reached out and slowly traced the line of my collarbone with his finger. His touch was electric, a sharp contrast to the freezing air of the house. "In this house, Alara, there are 3 rules," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "Rule number 1. You do not enter my private study or the West Wing. Some things are meant to stay buried and I don't like people who dig. Rule number 2. You attend every event I tell you to attend and you play the part of the perfect worshipful wife. You smile when I smile and you remain silent when I speak." I felt a spark of my old spirit flare up in my chest. "And rule number 3? His eyes darkened and he leaned in closer, until I could feel the heat of his breath against my skin. "Rule number 3. Do not fall in love with me. I didn't buy you for companionship. I bought you for a purpose. And love is a luxury that people like us can't afford. Do you understand?" "I think you'll find that rule very easy to follow, Mr. Thorne," I snapped, my voice trembling despite my bravado. A flash of something, was it amusement or anger, crossed his face. He pushed the doors open, revealing a master suite that was larger than my entire apartment. A massive bed with silver silk sheets sat in the center of the room. A fire was roaring in the hearth, but it provided no warmth to the atmosphere. "Your things are in the dressing room," he said, walking toward the window that overlooked the crashing waves below. "I have work to finish. Don't wait up for me. And Alara? Lock the door. Not to keep me out, but to remind yourself that you're safe from the rest of the world as long as you belong to me." He left before I could respond. I spent the next hour wandering the room like a ghost. I found my clothes hanging in the massive walk-in closet, sandwiched between his dark suits. It felt like my life was being swallowed by his. I changed into a simple silk nightgown and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Restlessness eventually drove me back into the hallway. The house felt even more alive at night, the wind howling through the stone corridors. I walked aimlessly until I found myself at the end of a long gallery. At the very end was a door I hadn't noticed before. A small, unassuming door hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind. Do not enter the West Wing. But my hand was already on the cold brass handle. I pushed it open, expecting a dusty storage room. Instead, I found a room filled with light. It was an art studio. Canvases were stacked against the walls, and the smell of oil paint and turpentine was thick in the air. I walked to the center of the room, where a single painting sat on an easel, covered by a black cloth. I reached out, my heart racing, and pulled the cloth away. I gasped. It was a portrait of a woman who looked exactly like me, but her eyes were filled with a sadness so profound it felt like a physical weight. Below the painting was a name carved into a small silver plaque. Isabella. "I told you not to dig," a voice boomed from the doorway. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Alaric was standing there, his shirt unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man haunted by 1,000 demons. He walked toward me, his face a mask of pure, terrifying rage. "Who is she?" I whispered, backed against the easel. He grabbed my wrist, his grip firm but not painful, pulling me away from the painting. He covered it back up with a violent jerk of the cloth. "She is the reason your father is still breathing," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "And she is the reason you are here. You think you're a bride, Alara? You're a ghost. You're a replacement for a debt that can never be paid." He looked at me then, and for the first time I didn't see the devil boss. I saw a man who was drowning in a grief so deep it had turned into hate. He didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, he pulled me flush against him, his eyes searching mine as if looking for a trace of the woman in the painting. "Get out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Go back to your room before I forget that I'm supposed to be the one in control." I ran. I ran until I was back in the silver silk bed, the sound of his ragged breathing still echoing in my ears. I realized then that I wasn't just married to a billionaire. I was married to a man who was using me to fight a war with his own past. And as the clock struck midnight, I knew that the slow burn between us wasn't just attraction, it was the heat of a fire that was going to burn us both to the ground. The morning brought no sunlight, only a heavy, oppressive gray that mirrored the mood inside the manor. I didn't see Alaric for breakfast. In fact, I didn't see him all day. It was as if our encounter in the hidden studio had turned me into a true ghost in his eyes. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a velvet box was delivered to my room by a maid who refused to meet my gaze. I opened it and the breath left my lungs. Inside lay a necklace of emeralds so deep they looked like frozen drops of forest water, surrounded by diamonds that caught the dim light like shards of ice. There was a note in the box. 2 words written in a sharp, arrogant scrawl. "Wear them." I knew who these belonged to before I even put them on. They weren't picked out for me. They were Isabella's. As I clasped the cold metal around my neck, I felt a shiver of dread. I wasn't being dressed for a party. I was being branded. When I walked down the grand staircase, Alaric was waiting at the bottom. He was in a tuxedo that made him look devastatingly handsome and dangerously sharp. He looked up and for a moment the air in the foyer seemed to vibrate. His eyes went straight to the emeralds, then to my face. His jaw tightened so hard I thought it might shatter. "You look adequate," he said, though the way his gaze lingered on my collarbone told a different story. He stepped closer, adjusting the necklace with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Tonight is the Silver Gala. Every person in that room will be looking for a crack in our story. If you falter, if you show even a hint of fear, they will tear you apart. Do you understand? Why are you making me wear her things, Alaric?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Is it because you want to see her, or because you want to punish me?" He didn't answer. He simply grabbed my hand and led me to the car. His grip was possessive, almost desperate. The gala was a whirlpool of light, expensive perfume and whispered venom. As we entered, the room fell into a hush that felt like a physical weight. I could feel the eyes on us, on my dress, on my face, and especially on the emeralds. Alaric didn't leave my side for a second. He stood behind me like a shadow, his hand constantly on the small of my back, a silent warning to anyone who dared to approach. But the peace didn't last. During the cocktail hour, a woman with hair like spun gold and eyes like daggers stepped into our path. Juliana, the daughter of a rival tech mogul and, according to the tabloids, the woman who was supposed to marry Alaric before I arrived. "Alaric, darling," she purred, her eyes raking over me with pure disgust. "I see you've found a new toy. But isn't it a bit macabre to dress the help in Isabella's jewels? Everyone knows those emeralds were meant to be buried with her memory." I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. The surrounding guests leaned in, their ears pricked for the scandal. I waited for Alaric to defend me, but he remained silent, his face a mask of stone. Juliana took a step closer to me, her voice dropping to a hiss. You're just a placeholder, honey. A little pawn in a big man's game. Do you really think he sees you when he looks at you? He's just staring at a corpse. I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye, but before it could fall, I felt a sudden intense heat at my back. Alaric moved. In one swift motion he stepped in front of me, his massive frame shielding me from Juliana and the rest of the room. "That's enough," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a lethal edge that made Juliana recoil. "Alaric, I was just—" "You were speaking to my wife," he interrupted, his eyes flashing with a terrifying dark fire. "And you were doing so without my permission. The emeralds are on her neck because she is the only woman in this room with the grace to wear them. If you ever speak to her or about her in that tone again, I will ensure your father's company is bankrupt by Monday morning. Now get out of my sight." The room was so silent you could hear the bubbles in the champagne glasses. Juliana turned and fled, her face pale with humiliation. Alaric didn't look at the crowd. He turned to me, his hands reaching up to cup my face. His thumbs brushed away the unshed tears. "Don't cry," he whispered, his voice suddenly raw and filled with a strange aching tension. "Never let them see you cry. You are a thorn now. And a thorn bows to no one." For a moment the gala disappeared. There was no music, no scandal, no Isabella. There was only the heat of his palms and the way he was looking at me. Not as a replacement, not as a debt, but as something he was prepared to burn the world down to protect. "Let's go," he said, his voice returning to its cold, commanding tone, but he didn't let go of my hand. As we walked out, I realized the danger had changed. I wasn't just afraid of the man I had married. I was afraid of the fact that when he stood up for me, my heart hadn't just ticked, it had roared. The devil boss was protecting his prize, and I was starting to realize that being his obsession was far more dangerous than being his enemy. The night of the gala should have been a victory, but the air in the car on the way home was thicker than a storm cloud. Alaric sat in the corner, his hands still gripped tightly around mine, his knuckles white. He didn't look like a man who had just defended his wife. He looked like a man who had just declared war on himself. The moment we stepped into the foyer of the manor, he dropped my hand as if it had turned into a branding iron and disappeared into the West Wing without a single word. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark fire in his gaze when he stood up for me. I saw the way his thumbs felt against my skin. I was sitting by the window watching the rain lash against the cliffs when I heard it. A heavy metallic thud from the direction of his study, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. The sound of breaking glass and a low, muffled groan of pain. I didn't think. Rule number 1 vanished from my mind. I ran down the dark corridor, my bare feet silent on the cold stone, and pushed open the heavy oak doors of his study. The room was in chaos. Books were scattered across the floor, and a crystal decanter had shattered against the desk. Alaric was slumped in his leather chair, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor. His white shirt was soaked, not with rain but with a deep, blossoming crimson. He was clutching his side, his face as pale as death, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Alaric!" I screamed, rushing to his side. He flinched, his eyes snapping open, glazed with pain and fever. "I told you not to come in here," he hissed, but his voice lacked its usual sting. It was weak, trembling. "You're bleeding," I cried, my hands hovering over the wound. "I'm calling a doctor." He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong even in his weakened state. "No. No doctors. No one can know about this. It was an ambush. On the way back from the gala. I thought I had handled them. Just get the kit. Bottom drawer. Now." I did as I was told, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack. I returned with the medical supplies, my hands shaking. I had to peel back his shirt, and as the fabric came away I gasped. It wasn't just a fresh wound. His chest and shoulders were a map of old scars, reminders of a life spent in a darkness I couldn't even imagine. "Stop staring," he grunted, wincing as I began to clean the wound. "Just fix it, Alara." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and his labored breathing. As I worked, my fear began to turn into something else. A deep, aching empathy. This was the devil of Wall Street, the man who owned half the city, and here he was, bleeding out in the dark, too proud and too paranoid to ask for help from anyone but the woman he claimed to hate. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my fingers grazing the warm skin of his abdomen as I bandaged him. "Why do you carry all of this alone?" He looked up at me then, the fever making his dark eyes look like liquid obsidian. "Because in my world, Alara, vulnerability is a death sentence. My father taught me that a thorn doesn't feel pain. We only inflict it." He was wrong, I said, my voice steady for the first time. I reached up, moving a damp lock of hair from his forehead. "You're not a machine, Alec. No matter how much you want to be." He didn't pull away this time. He leaned into my touch, a long, shaky breath escaping his lips. For a fleeting second, the wall between us crumbled. The billionaire, the devil, the boss, he was gone. There was only a man, broken and bleeding, looking at me as if I were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice a mere thread of sound. "I bought you. I humiliated you. I trapped you in this house. You should want me to bleed out." "Maybe I'm just as broken as you are," I replied, my eyes meeting his. "Or maybe I'm the only person in the world who isn't afraid of your shadows." He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped the back of my neck, pulling me down until our foreheads were touching. I could smell the iron of blood and the scent of the rain on him. "Don't be kind to me, Alara," he whispered, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. "Kindness is a trap. I don't know how to handle it. I'll only end up breaking you." "Then break me," I whispered back, the slow burn tension of the last few weeks finally reaching its boiling point. He didn't kiss me. He just held me there in the quiet of the study as the clock ticked away the hours of the night. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch, a silent pact made in the dark. I was nursing a monster and he was realizing that his cage was no longer empty. But as I watched him fall into a fitful, feverish sleep, I knew that the people who had attacked him wouldn't stop. The war was coming to our front door and the devil boss was no longer fighting for an empire. He was fighting for me. The days following the attack were a fragile peace. Alaric was healing, his body mending even as his spirit remained on high alert. He didn't return to the cold, distant man he was before. Instead, he became a silent, watchful shadow. He stayed in the rooms I occupied, his eyes following me as I moved, as if he were afraid that if he looked away, I would evaporate like the morning mist. But the silence of the manor wasn't a peaceful one. It was the silence before the earth shatters. It happened on a night when the moon was hidden by thick, suffocating clouds. I was in the kitchen making tea to help Alaric sleep when the power died. The manor plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. My heart stopped. I felt the familiar prickle of fear on the back of my neck, but before I could scream, a hand clamped over my mouth. "Don't make a sound," a voice hissed. It was Alaric. Even in the pitch black I could feel the heat of him, the tension in his muscles. He didn't have his suit on. He was in a simple black shirt, a heavy handgun gripped in his free hand. He pulled me into the pantry, his body shielding mine against the wall. "They're inside," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. The security feeds were cut from the inside. It wasn't just a random hit to Lara. It was a betrayal. My brother, Marcus, he's come to claim what he thinks is his. I felt a cold dread wash over me. Marcus. The Thorn brother who had been exiled years ago, the one who was whispered to be even more ruthless than Alaric. "I'm not letting them take you," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a growl that was more animal than man. "Listen to me. There is a passage behind the wine cellar. It leads to the cliffs. You run and you don't stop until you find the Coast Guard station. I'm not leaving you," I whispered, grabbing the front of his shirt. "Alaric, you're still hurt. You can't fight them alone." He leaned down, his lips crushing against mine for a brief, desperate second. A kiss that tasted of iron, salt, and a decade of suppressed longing. You are the only thing in this world that is untainted, Alara. I won't let my past destroy you. Now go. He pushed me toward the cellar door just as the sound of breaking glass echoed through the foyer. I ran, my lungs burning, but I didn't go to the cliffs. I couldn't. I hid in the shadows of the balcony overlooking the grand hall. I watched as Marcus stepped into the light of a flashlight, surrounded by armed men. He looked like a twisted reflection of Alaric, the same sharp features but filled with a hollow, manic greed. Alaric stepped out of the darkness to meet him, standing tall despite the bandage hidden under his shirt. Where is she, Alaric? Marcus sneered, leveling a gun at his brother's chest. Where is the girl who looks like Isabella? The board is tired of your obsession. They want a leader who isn't haunted by a dead woman's face. Give her to me and maybe I'll let you leave this house alive. Alaric let out a low, dark laugh that chilled me to the bone. You think this is about a ghost, Marcus? I used to think so too. I thought I bought her to fill a hole in my soul. I was wrong. I didn't marry her because she looks like the past. I married her because she's the only future I have left. And you aren't touching a single hair on her head. The room erupted. Alaric moved with a speed that defied his injuries. The sound of gunfire shattered the silence of the manor. I saw Alaric take down 2 men, his movements precise and lethal, but Marcus was closing in. I didn't think. I grabbed a heavy bronze bust from a pedestal and threw it with everything I had. It crashed into a chandelier, sending a shower of glass and metal down on Marcus's head. In that moment of distraction, Alaric lunged. He tackled Marcus to the ground, the 2 brothers a blur of rage and shadow. It ended with Alaric standing over him, the barrel of his gun pressed to Marcus's forehead. Get out of my house, Alaric hissed, his voice echoing through the ruins of the foyer. And if I ever see your face again, I won't be a brother. I'll be the devil you've always claimed I am. The men retreated, dragging a dazed Marcus with them into the night. Alaric stood there, his chest heaving, blood seeping through his shirt once more. He looked up at the balcony and our eyes met. He didn't say a word. He just opened his arms. I ran down the stairs and threw myself into him, sobbing against his chest. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his heart thumping a frantic, broken rhythm against mine. You stayed, he whispered into my hair, his voice cracking with an emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. Why did you stay? Because the devil boss needs someone to keep him human, I replied, looking up at him through my tears. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the shattered marble and broken glass. The empire was in ruins, the contract was blood-stained, and the secrets of Isabella were finally buried in the past. Alaric took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. He didn't look back at the manor. He looked at the horizon. The 30 days are over, Alara. The debt is paid. You're free. I looked at the man who had burned his world down to keep me safe. I looked at the scars on his hands and the softness in his eyes. I don't want to be free, Alaric, I said, a small smile touching my lips. I want to be yours. He didn't smirk. He didn't command. He simply leaned down and kissed me, a slow, deep promise that the war was over. The devil had found his angel, and for the first time in his life, Alaric Thorne wasn't looking for an empire. He had found his home. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. And remember, sometimes the person you're most afraid of is the only one who can truly save you.